Okay, and so we're going to start now at page 271, and we're at the end of part 4, and where we're picking up is where Daniel Rook has just has just been part of the punitive expedition, and the natives have run away. They've come in contact with Warrengan, who's at the camp, and the men are boisterous, raucous, because maybe of the excitement. They're having a party, and at the bottom of 271, there's a big discovery about to happen. So Rook helps Silk. Silk is unbuckling his pack, and he thinks he's trying to find his journal. Rook leans over to help him by holding the flap, and he's taken the bottom of the bag by mistake, and everything falls out. Okay, the thing upended, and what happens here is a hatchet slips out. It has a freshly honed edge, a freshly sharpened edge, basically indicating it's ready to be used. And it has, around it is several folded canvas bags. And Rook is like, what are you planning, to cut your own firewood? And he feels on edge. He feels the edge, and it's sharp enough to shave with. Silk's not amused, and he grabs the hatchet out of Rook's hand. He thrusts it back into the bottom of the pack, almost like he's hiding it. And Wilstead is watching on. There was something about the hatchet that Wilstead knew. And Silk's like, out with it. What, did you hope to bring back a couple of trophies for Dr. Waymark to paint? Like, were you going to carve wood with it? And Rook notices that hatchet has actually drawn blood. It's so sharp that in the ball of his thumb, he's actually cut himself. Wilstead says, well, you're not so far off the mark. Trophy is very near the case. So that double meaning of the word trophy, an actual trophy, like a carved trophy like we present for first, second, third, but a trophy in this case, another type of prize. He was vastly entertained by some idea. The fact that he finds this entertaining, maybe you as a reader might be able to infer what this trophy is, which is about to be revealed to us directly as the reader. But Wilstead's entertainment at this, the fact that he's entertained by this issue, really does emphasise, and the notes I've taken, is his callous nature, his uncaring nature. And then Rook is beginning to work out what's happening. So it's not the hatchet, not the bags, but the set of Silk's face, a tone in his voice that puts a chill into Rook. And Rook is working out this particular type of sum, the hatchet plus the bags multiplied by Wilstead's smirk divided by the look on Silk's face, and he realises Silk might have a word. The hatchet, Silk, and the bags. May I ask for what purpose they were brought? Well, Rook, natives were by preference to be captured and brought in, but if that did not prove practicable, then my orders were that 6 be slain. Practicable. Yes, practical. And the bags, the heads of the slain were to be brought back. Oh, the heads of the slain, he repeated. The heads, Rook, were to be brought back in the bags provided, having been severed with the hatchet provided. The governor's argument was that it was necessary to act harshly once in order to not to have to act harshly again. The punishment inflicted on a few would be an act of mercy to all others. I think it's quite ironic that it's certainly not a mercy. And it does make you question whether this type of harsh punishments actually work. And my argument, if it does work, then countries with the death penalty, for example, would have much lower crime rates than those that do not. find out if that's the truth. Hint, hint, it's not. Anyway, Rook, this was never going to happen. I did not mention the hatchet because it was never going to be used. No natives have been captured, no heads have been removed, nor will they be. And then Rook goes through, he's processing this, and he actually is thinking about how, like, the logistics of cutting off somebody's head, how you would have to follow this order. And it really exposes this gruesome reality. And so page 274 and 275, Rook reasons through, and it's his inner monologue, so it's his inner thoughts and how he would actually have to go about cutting off a man's head. And it's just this gross, like, very vivid description of, like, turning him over and putting him on his side. You'd have to hack at the slain skin of the neck. Somebody would have to hold the head. Then you'd have to put it in the bag. You'd have to pick it up by the hair. Somebody else would have to open the bag. And then it's like working through the practicalities of actually carrying it back. It would be followed by flies. The bouncing would irritate. It's funny. It's almost this calculated way he's analysing it. And reasoning through this absolutely disgusting thought. And here, right at the end after he's come to this end of this rationalization of how you would go through it if you had to follow that order, he questions, how could you actually do that? Could you do this given the human soul behind the head with these exquisite nuances of feeling? At the end of 75, top of 276, he actually vomits in horror and disgust. He stumbles away into the bushes where he was loudly, thoroughly sick. So he goes pale. So he vomits in disgust and horror at the brutality, at the calculated nature, at that just this horrific order that they may have been forced to obey. And so then on 276, Rook stares out into the distance. He's looking at the waves, and 277, there's this beautiful passage where he looks at the water and he sees it as he had never seen it before. One body of water that encircles the globe, and the continents nothing more than insignificant obstacles around which it effortlessly flowed. The land, much less the people on it, was irrelevant to this enormous breathing being. Notice the personification of the water here. And this water that encircles the globe is kind of like a metaphor. And I believe my argument is that it represents the unity of humanity. The fact that we are all one. Okay? It's divided up on the map, but its parts are given different names. Names were not just irrelevant, but false. It was all one, every drop acting separately yet together with all its fellows, swelling and sinking in accordance with that plate of yellow in the sky. And I think that kind of links with something that Rook mentioned early on, that like what's done to one person is done to the whole, and we're like the sum of the whole is greater than all of its individual parts. And that idea of that the beauty of humanity and how it is so precious and valuable. Really, this metaphor of the water, the ocean, emphasizes that. Something you could include in your essays, where the recognition of the value of human life and the poetic description of that here, 277. And he has this, 278, he has this smell of his own disgust. And then 278, he actually steps into the shallows of the water and he rubs at his hands, his face, his hair. And as he goes into the water, he is a floating nothing. He's not land, not sea, not this world, not of another. Daniel Rook, who occupied the rank of second lieutenant, he's not that Daniel Rook, but he's a mass without a name. This metaphorical description of him washing is almost like he's being cleansed of defilement. He's been cleansed of the sin. He's been cleansed of this unjust order. He's been cleansed of Second Lieutenant Rook, and he is being able to be washed clean and purified from the unpleasantness, and he emerges anew. 279, again, he looks up in the stars, and the star Sirius, which is part of a constellation of the Great Dog, but for the Indigenous people, it would be a completely different name and a different story for how that constellation came to be. But whatever you called the stars, their patterns were the same. And again, that sense of unity and the value of the different perspectives, that they're not better or worse, but just different. And 279, Rook is having a moment of realization. And Rook had accused the governor of faulty logic and scoffed at Silk, but he had used the same sophistication, I guess. He persuaded himself that as long as the expedition fails, there was no harm in being part of it. He thought he'd been so clever in warning Tagaran. He had cranked the handle of his stratagem. Notice that metaphor, that he'd actually put into place this strategy. And he smirked to see the gears mesh, the wheels begin to turn in the machine that would let him obey while keeping his hands clean. But he can see now that he was exactly as guilty as the governor and Silk. Like him, he had allowed self-interest to blind him. And he groans, a heavy, inarticulate, He realizes now that it's the simplest thing in the world. If an action was wrong, it did not matter whether it succeeded or not, or how many clever steps you took to make sure it failed. If you were part of the act, you were part of its wrong. You did not have to take up the hatchet or even walk along with the expedition. If you were part of that machine, you were part of its evil. It's a great place to take quotes on about that theme of morality, and that in any way being part of a wrong action, you are complicit, you are responsible. And bottom of 280, he thinks about the last 2 years encountering the Indigenous people at Sydney Cove and the Daniel Rook, the Lieutenant Rook that arrived 2 years before, seems to have been replaced syllable by some other man, by Kamara Rook. Yeah. By the Rook that is bold and confident and able to disobey an order, to be true to his morals. Okay. And 281, he thinks of all the things he had learned with Tagaran. He can't really attach a name for everything he'd felt for her, but she had shown him the existence of the man he could be. That man was not just a lieutenant in His Majesty's service. That man knew how to sit as well as act, how to listen as well as speak, how to feel as well as think. He had discovered truths, powerful in spite of having no names, about two people and what they might share. That powerful intimacy of a deep and meaningful relationship, not a sexual one, a familial relationship, one that transcends names, transcends the titles. And now he realizes that this man had nothing to do with expeditions involving coils of rope and muskets, much less with sharpened hatchets and bags the right size for carrying human heads. To remain with the expedition was to turn his back on the man he had become. To refuse any part of it would be to step into the void. So to actually now be true to his morals, be true to his conscience, is like taking a step into this unknown. And he remembers the mutiny, those images of the one who had been hanged. He could smell the shit of him. And he remembers the shaved heads, the cropped heads and the jackets of the other lieutenants. Some things went too deep for forgetting. And he watches the river, watches the ocean as this wave is coming on. And he makes a decision, not by thought, not logic, not calculation, like an impulse. of the body. Like he just knows it's right. It's a reflex that was beyond reason. And he articulates his decision. I cannot be part of this, he says it aloud. And he doesn't know what difficult path this new Daniel Rook might take him down or where it would end, but he only knows that he was prepared to welcome the stranger and follow where he led. And so then 282, he actually packs himself up and he leaves. Symbolically, him leaving while the others are sleeping, representing his turning his back, his disapproval of this act, the punitive expedition. And so he leaves and he comes back to the settlement. And page 284, he confronts Governor Gilbert and he says, well, the natives eluded us. It was a failure. Page 285 here. And here is where you want to have some great phrases for the assertive declarations, the emphatic statements that Rook makes here. If they're not tentative, they're not hesitant, he's not casually mentioning it, he is strongly exclaiming these powerful moral truths. Okay. Sir, it was badly done, he says. It was a wicked plan, sir. I am sorry to have been persuaded to comply with the order. I would not, for any reason, ever again obey a similar order. And his words, he actually feels relief like a sneeze to expel them at the governor. Okay. So when he actually finally is truthful and confronts the governor, it's this sense of relief like a sneeze. His governor's face is slack with astonishment, but Rook feels weightless and nothing but relief. He knows that something is finished for him. His time in the Marines is finished, but he is relieved. And he keeps going. He says, sir, your orders were a most gravely wrong thing. I regret beyond words my part in the business. Okay? And the governor's like almost acting as if he hadn't heard. But how many were killed? How many were got? Rook was set alight. I beg your pardon, sir, but that is beyond the point. The intention of evil was there, which is all God sees when he looks into our hearts. And he sees the governor flinch at the word God, and we're surprised for using it. He feels like it's a cheap trick to silence the governor, when what he truly felt was that God was just a way for man to interrogate his own heart. So he doesn't particularly believe himself, but he uses it to confront the governor, maybe because he knows he believes. And the governor says, well, you're mighty sure of yourself and mighty free with the Almighty's name. And they all kind of pause. Lieutenant Rook is asked to attend the governor midday at Government House. And then this confrontation is over. Rook goes to his hut. He's going to light his fire. He's going to boil water and make tea. And he knows that depending on when the ships arrive from England, he might have a few weeks or a few months. He might go on measuring the rainfall, but sooner or later, His Majesty's grand machine, good quote, would take him into itself. He would be sent away. He would stand and listen as a court pronounced his sentence. Then he would be taken from that place and obliged to submit to one other kind of death or other, the death of the body or the death of the future. So he knows that his consequence for this act of disobedience will either be death, he'll be hanged, or death of the future, he has no future. So here, my interpretation is that Grenville's authorial voice through this act of rebellion, I guess, is that to be true to act in accordance to one's conscience, it is worth even sacrificing one's life for, because Rook, it feels a freedom and a relief through finally standing up against the injustice, and that he feels like he's right in this act. So we see that truth, I guess, that even at the risk of death, being true to one's conscience, standing up against injustice is necessary, is part of being true to oneself. And this final astronomy metaphors being used, that these stars he looks up at, they can't be seen, but they're still there, hanging in their appointed places. These truths that, whatever you call them, are always there. The constants, perhaps the moral constant of right and wrong, is also always there. And also the bigger picture of the unity of humanity and the preciousness of humanity alongside that right and wrong. And so that is the end of part 4. Thank you for joining us on the journey, and well done.